The morning mist, thick and clinging like a shroud, still hugged the low-lying fields of the Belle Reve Plantation when the first scream tore through the pre-dawn quiet. It wasn't a scream of pain, nor of fear in the usual sense, but one of utter, bewildered impossibility. It was the sound of a mind grappling with a reality that simply could not be. Old man Tiber, his back bent from decades of toil, had been on his way to rouse the occupants of cabin No. 7, his usual morning chore. He carried a bucket of water, its surface reflecting the pale, nascent light of the rising sun. His eyes, accustomed to the dimness, had always found the familiar silhouette of the cabin, a dark block against the slightly lighter sky. But this morning, there was no block. There was no silhouette. There was only the mist swirling gently over a patch of bare earth. Tiber stopped dead, the bucket clattering to the ground, water sloshing over his bare feet. He blinked, rubbed his eyes with a gnarled hand, and looked again. The spot where cabin No. 7 had stood for as long as he could remember, where his own parents had lived before him, was empty. Not burned, not collapsed, not even a pile of rubble. Just empty. The ground was flat, save for the perfectly outlined rectangle of the stone foundation, now exposed to the cool morning air. The stones themselves were clean as if they had been scrubbed. No splintered wood, no scattered nails, no charred remains, no disturbed earth around the perimeter. Nothing. His scream, a raw, guttural sound, echoed across the quarters, pulling others from their sleep. First came the murmurs, then the confused questions, then the gasps of disbelief as they too witnessed the impossible void. A small crowd gathered, their breath pluming in the chill, their faces etched with a mixture of terror and profound bewilderment. They circled the empty space, their eyes scanning the surrounding trees, the distant fields, as if the cabin might have simply been misplaced, perhaps rolled away by some unseen force. But the ground was undisturbed, the dew still fresh on the grass beyond the foundation. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed the structure whole, then meticulously smoothed over its tracks. Silas Croft, the overseer, was roused by the commotion. He burst from his small, unkempt house near the main road, his nightshirt flapping, a shotgun clutched in one hand. His face, usually a mask of sour authority, was contorted with a mixture of sleep-addled confusion and burgeoning rage. "What in tarnation is all this racket?" he bellowed, his voice hoarse. Then he saw it. His eyes, still bleary, focused on the gathering of dark figures, all pointing towards the same impossible absence. He pushed through the crowd, his boots crunching on the gravel path, his breath catching in his throat as he reached the edge of the empty space. He stared, his jaw slack, the shotgun lowering slowly in his hand until its barrel rested on the ground. His mind, accustomed to the brutal logic of the plantation, struggled to process the scene. A cabin. A solid cypress wood cabin, built on a sturdy stone foundation secured with iron nails. Gone, without a trace. He knelt, his knees cracking, and ran a trembling hand over the smooth, cool surface of a foundation stone. It was clean. Too clean. He sniffed the air, expecting the acrid scent of smoke, the damp smell of rot, the metallic tang of blood. But there was nothing but the faint, sweet smell of dew-kissed earth and the distant aroma of wood smoke from the other cabins. The sun, now a fiery orange orb on the horizon, cast long, distorted shadows across the impossible void, making the absence even more profound, more sinister. The silence that followed his initial outburst was heavy, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. It was the silence of a world suddenly unhinged, where the very ground beneath their feet seemed to have betrayed its solidity. The impossible had not just happened. It had happened with an eerie, meticulous precision that defied all understanding. April of 1865 in Louisiana was a time of profound, unsettling transition. The air itself seemed to hum with an unspoken tension, a mixture of dread and a nascent, terrifying hope. The Civil War, a brutal 4-year-long nightmare, was drawing to a close. News, often distorted and delayed, trickled down from the north. Richmond had fallen. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. For the white plantation owners, it meant ruin, the collapse of their entire way of life. For the enslaved, it meant a whisper of freedom, a dream so long deferred it felt almost mythical, yet now tantalizingly close. But proximity to freedom did not equate to its immediate embrace. The chains, though perhaps looser, were still very much present, enforced by desperate men clinging to a dying order. Belle Reve, a sprawling cotton and sugarcane plantation nestled deep in the bayou country, was no exception. Its grand, columned main house, once a symbol of opulence, now showed signs of neglect, its paint peeling, its gardens overgrown. The fields, stretching for hundreds of acres, were still worked by the forced labor of nearly 100 souls, their sweat and toil the only thing keeping the plantation afloat. The slave quarters, a cluster of a dozen or so cabins set a quarter-mile from the main house, were a stark contrast to the owner's residence. These were simple, functional structures, built for utility, not comfort. Cabin number 7 stood slightly apart from the others, closer to the edge of the woods that bordered the western perimeter of the plantation. It was a sturdy, rectangular dwelling, roughly 15 feet by 20 feet, constructed primarily of rough-hewn cypress logs, chinked with mud and moss to keep out the biting Louisiana damp. The roof was a simple gable, covered with cypress shingles, weathered to a dull silver gray. What set cabin number 7 apart, in terms of its construction, was its foundation. Not just earth and loose stones, but a carefully laid perimeter of large, flat river stones, mortared together with a mixture of lime and sand. This made it more stable, less prone to flooding, and a testament to the skill of the enslaved builders who had erected it decades ago. The door, made of thick planks, was secured by a heavy iron latch, and the single window, covered with a wooden shutter, faced east, catching the morning sun. Inside it was sparse. A dirt floor, a small hearth for cooking and warmth, and a few rough-hewn sleeping platforms. Within these walls lived a family, bound by blood and circumstance, who would soon become the center of an impossible mystery. Ilara, the matriarch, was in her late 50s, though the harshness of her life had etched lines on her face that made her appear older. Her hair, once black, was now a salt and pepper braid that hung down her back. Her eyes, however, were still sharp, observant, and held a deep, quiet wisdom. She was a healer, a storyteller, and a keeper of traditions, her hands skilled with herbs, and her mind a repository of ancestral knowledge. She moved with a deliberate grace, her presence a calming anchor in the turbulent lives of those around her. She had seen generations come and go, witnessed countless injustices, and held on to a flicker of hope that she rarely spoke aloud. Her son, Tobias, was a man of 40, his frame lean but powerful, his hands calloused from years of working with wood. He was a carpenter by trade, a skill highly valued on the plantation, and his work was meticulous. He could mend a broken wagon wheel, fashion a sturdy stool, or repair a leaky roof with an almost artistic precision. Tobias was a man of few words, preferring to express himself through his craft. He possessed an innate understanding of structures, of how things fit together, and how they could be taken apart. His quiet nature often masked a keen intellect and a deep sense of responsibility for his family. Lena, Tobias's daughter and Ilara's granddaughter, was a vibrant young woman of 20. Her intelligence shone in her bright, inquisitive eyes. She had a thirst for knowledge, often listening intently to the hushed conversations of the house servants, piecing together fragments of news from the outside world. Lena was quick-witted and resourceful, her spirit unbroken despite the confines of her existence. She often helped Ilara with her healing remedies, learning the properties of plants and the art of listening. She was also fiercely protective of her younger brother Caleb. Caleb, at 10 years old, was an observant boy, his curiosity boundless. He was often found exploring the edges of the woods, watching the birds, or simply sitting quietly, absorbing the world around him. He had a knack for noticing small details that others overlooked. A broken branch, a misplaced stone, a change in the wind. His innocence was a fragile shield against the harsh realities of the plantation, but his sharp mind was already beginning to question the world he inhabited. Ruth, a quiet woman in her late 30s, was not directly related by blood to Ilara's family, but had been taken in by them years ago after her own family was sold off. She was a woman of deep memory, her mind a repository of small details, faces and events that others might forget. She rarely spoke, but her eyes missed nothing, and her presence was a comforting, steadying force within the cabin. Daniel, a strong man in his early 40s, was Ruth's husband. He was a man of immense physical power, capable of felling trees and moving heavy loads with ease. Like Tobias, he was a man of few words, his communication often through gestures or a shared glance. He possessed a quiet dignity and an unwavering loyalty to those he considered his family. The overseer, Silas Croft, was a man in his late 40s, his face perpetually flushed from drink and sun. He was a man of limited imagination and even less empathy, driven by a desperate need to maintain order and prove his worth to the plantation owner, Mr. Beaumont. Croft's authority was absolute, enforced with a whip and a cruel tongue. He saw the enslaved as property, nothing more, and the thought of them as individuals with hopes or dreams was anathema to him. The war's end, and the rumors of emancipation, had made him increasingly volatile. His surveillance of the quarters more intense, his punishments more arbitrary. He was a man teetering on the edge, terrified of losing the only power he had ever known. Daily life on Belle Reve was a relentless cycle of labor. From before dawn until after dusk, the fields demanded their tribute. The air was often thick with the scent of rich earth, sweat, and the distant cloying sweetness of boiling sugar cane. Sundays offered a brief respite, a chance for communal gathering, for hushed prayers and shared stories, for Ilara to dispense her remedies and wisdom. But even these moments were shadowed by the ever-present threat of Croft's watchful eye, the knowledge that their lives were not their own. The yearning for freedom was a constant, burning ember beneath the surface of their daily existence, a silent prayer whispered into the Louisiana night. The specific construction of cabin number 7, with its sturdy cypress wood and carefully laid stone foundation, was a detail that would soon take on an almost mythical significance. The first sign was subtle, easily dismissed. A hammer, Tobias's favorite, went missing from the small communal tool shed near the stable. It wasn't a valuable tool to Mr. Beaumont, but to Tobias it was an extension of his own hand. He searched for it for 2 days, his brow furrowed, before it mysteriously reappeared, not in the shed, but leaning against the side of cabin number 7, as if someone had simply forgotten it there. Tobias picked it up, a strange prickle of unease running down his spine. He knew he hadn't left it there. He looked around, but no one was nearby. He shrugged it off, attributing it to a careless field hand. But the incident lingered in his mind. Then came the sawdust. Not the fine, powdery dust from the mill, but coarse, fresh cypress sawdust. Caleb, with his keen eyes, noticed it first. A faint trail leading from the edge of the woods towards cabin number 7, then abruptly vanishing near the cabin's back wall. He pointed it out to Lena, who knelt and examined it. "Looks like someone's been cutting wood," she murmured, "but there's no new wood around here." They looked towards the woods, but the trees seemed undisturbed. The next morning, the sawdust was gone, swept away by the wind or perhaps by something else. A few days later, Ruth, on her way to the communal wash area by the creek, noticed something peculiar on a large oak tree that marked the boundary between the quarters and the deeper woods. There were faint, shallow gouges on its bark, not deep enough to be axe marks, but more like something heavy had been dragged against it, perhaps repeatedly. She touched the rough bark, her brow furrowed in thought. It was too high for an animal, too regular for a random scrape. She didn't say anything, but the image stayed with her. Caleb, meanwhile, began to report strange sounds at night. "I hear whispers, Mama Lena," he'd say, his eyes wide, and sometimes a soft thud, like something falling but not loud. Lena would soothe him, telling him it was just the wind or an owl or the creaking of the old cabin. But Caleb was insistent. He described a rhythmic, almost musical tapping, followed by long silences. He also spoke of shadows moving in the moonlit yard, shadows that were too large, too deliberate to be animals. He swore he saw Tobias and Daniel sometimes moving like ghosts in the dark, but when he asked them in the morning, they would simply shake their heads, their faces unreadable. Other slaves, too, began to notice a shift. The occupants of cabin number 7, usually a close-knit but open family, seemed to become more insular. Their conversations were quieter, their glances more frequent and meaningful. They moved with a new, almost imperceptible urgency, a shared secret hanging in the air around them. Old man Tiber, who often shared a pipe with Tobias in the evenings, found Tobias increasingly distracted, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter, his ears cocked for distant sounds. When Tiber asked if anything was amiss, Tobias would simply grunt, "Just tired, old man. Long days." Silas Croft, the overseer, was not a man of great intuition, but he was a man of suspicion. The war's end had frayed his nerves, making him jumpy and irritable. He felt a shift in the air, a subtle defiance he couldn't quite grasp. The quietness of cabin No. 7, rather than reassuring him, made him uneasy. He began to increase his nightly patrols, walking the perimeter of the quarters more frequently, his lantern casting dancing shadows. He would stop outside cabin number 7, listening intently, trying to catch a stray word, a suspicious sound. He saw nothing, heard nothing out of the ordinary, but the feeling persisted. Something was brewing. He started watching Tobias more closely, noticing the carpenter's intense focus, his almost obsessive attention to detail in his work. Croft couldn't shake the feeling that Tobias was planning something, but his limited imagination couldn't conceive of what it might be. He dismissed it as the usual slave cunning, a petty theft perhaps, or a planned escape of one or two individuals. He never imagined the scale of what was truly unfolding. The tension in the quarters grew, a silent, invisible weight. The residents of cabin number 7 moved with a heightened awareness, their senses sharpened by the constant threat of discovery. Every creak of the main house, every distant bark of a dog, every rustle in the bushes sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. They communicated mostly through glances, subtle hand gestures, and the shared understanding that had been forged over generations of oppression. Ilara, with her calm demeanor, was the anchor, her quiet strength a balm to their frayed nerves. She would offer a knowing look to Lena, a reassuring touch to Caleb, a silent nod to Tobias and Daniel. The preparations, whatever they were meticulous, slow, and fraught with immense danger. Each disappearing tool, each faint sawdust trail, each mark on a tree was a tiny thread in a tapestry of audacious defiance, a tapestry that was slowly, painstakingly being woven in the dark. The near discoveries were terrifying. A patrol passing just as a heavy timber was being lowered, a sudden gust of wind almost revealing a hidden stack of wood, a dog barking at a shadow that was almost certainly Daniel. Each close call only solidified their resolve, hardening their will against the immense odds. The true story of cabin number 7 began not with its disappearance, but with its meticulous, silent dismantling, a feat of engineering and courage that unfolded over several agonizing weeks. It was a plan born of desperation and fueled by the whispers of freedom, orchestrated by Ilara's quiet wisdom and executed by Tobias's skilled hands and Daniel's brute strength. Lena and Ruth were the vigilant eyes and ears, and even young Caleb, unknowingly, played his part. The first step was the tools. Tobias, with Daniel's help, began to borrow specific implements from the plantation's tool shed: a heavy pry bar, a set of chisels, a specialized saw, a coil of strung rope, and a few small sharp axes. These were taken under the cover of darkness, used, cleaned meticulously, and then returned, often to a slightly different spot, creating the illusion of carelessness or misplacement that had so puzzled Silas Croft. Tobias even crafted a few custom tools in secret, using scraps of metal and wood designed for silent deconstruction. The work began with the roof. Cypress shingles, though sturdy, were nailed in place. Tobias discovered that by carefully prying up the edges with a thin, flat piece of metal he'd fashioned, and then using a small, padded mallet to tap the nails from beneath, they could be removed with minimal sound. Each shingle was then carefully lowered one by Lena and Ruth, who stood on stools inside the cabin, passing them down to Tobias and Daniel. These shingles were then carried in small, manageable bundles deep into the bordering woods, where they were stacked and covered with leaves and branches, blending seamlessly with the forest floor. This process took several nights, each one fraught with the risk of discovery. Next came the walls. The cypress logs, though heavy, were not mortared together, but rather notched and fitted, then secured with large hand-forged iron nails. Tobias had spent weeks studying the cabin's construction, understanding its weaknesses. He devised a system of levers and fulcrums, using smaller logs and sturdy branches found in the woods. At night, under the cover of the darkest hours, Tobias and Daniel would work on one section of a wall. They would carefully pry the chinking out, then use the pry bar and levers to gently lift a log, just enough to allow Tobias to work on the nails. He had learned that by heating the iron nails slightly with a small contained flame, a trick he'd learned from a blacksmith, they became more pliable, less likely to snap or squeal when pulled. Each nail was removed with agonizing slowness, then carefully collected in a canvas bag. The logs themselves were the biggest challenge. Each one was immensely heavy. They couldn't simply be dropped. Tobias and Daniel developed a system using ropes and a series of strategically placed tree stumps and low branches in the woods. Once a log was freed from the wall, it was carefully lowered onto a makeshift sled, a flat piece of wood Tobias had salvaged, and then slowly, painstakingly dragged into the woods. The path they used was carefully chosen, avoiding dry leaves that would crunch, sticking to softer earth or areas covered in pine needles. The marks Ruth had seen on the oak tree were from the ropes and logs being dragged past it, a silent testament to their monumental effort. Lena and Ruth were crucial in this phase. While Tobias and Daniel worked on the logs, they would be inside, meticulously cleaning up any debris, any stray nail, any piece of chinking that might have fallen. They also acted as lookouts, their ears attuned to the slightest sound from the main house or Croft's quarters. Caleb, though not directly involved in the dismantling, was often awake, his young ears picking up the muffled sounds, his eyes occasionally catching a glimpse of the shadowy figures. He never fully understood what he was seeing, but his innocent observations later served as fragmented clues. The psychological toll was immense. Every night was a gamble with their lives. The fear of being caught, of the brutal punishment that awaited them, was a constant, gnawing presence. Yet the hope of freedom, the image of a life unburdened, pushed them forward. Ilara, during the day, would maintain her usual demeanor, her calm presence a shield against suspicion. But at night, she would sit by the hearth, her eyes fixed on the door, her heart pounding with every creak and rustle. She would offer silent prayers, her ancestors' spirits invoked to guide and protect her family. The final nights were the most dangerous. Only the floorboards and the supporting beams remained. These were easier to remove, as they were less visible from the outside. The floorboards were pried up, stacked, and carried away. The main support beams, the heaviest of all, required the combined strength of Tobias, Daniel, and even Ruth and Lena, using a complex system of ropes and rollers to move them. They worked in complete silence, their movements synchronized, their breathing shallow. The air inside the cabin, as it slowly disappeared, grew colder, more open to the elements, a stark reminder of their progress. By the last night, only the stone foundation remained, and a few scattered pieces of wood that had been too small to bother with. These were gathered, carried deep into the swamp, and submerged, weighted down with rocks. The ground around the foundation was then meticulously swept, any disturbed earth smoothed over, any stray nail or splinter picked up. They even used damp cloths to wipe down the exposed foundation stones, removing any lingering dust or residue. The coordinated timing was impeccable, chosen to coincide with a particularly dark, moonless night and a period when Croft was known to be heavily in his cups, less likely to conduct thorough patrols. As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, they retreated to other cabins, their bodies aching, their minds exhausted, but a fierce, quiet triumph burning in their hearts. The impossible had been achieved. The dawn of that fateful day broke with an unusual stillness. The air was cool, damp, and heavy with the scent of magnolias and the distant, earthy smell of the bayou. A thin, ethereal mist, like a veil drawn across the landscape, softened the edges of the world. The usual cacophony of the plantation, the crowing of roosters, the distant lowing of cattle, the early morning chatter of the field hands, was muted, as if holding its breath. Old man Tiber, as was his custom, was the first to stir from his cabin, a few doors down from where cabin number 7 should have been. He carried his bucket, his mind already on the day's tasks, his eyes half closed against the nascent light. He walked the familiar path, his bare feet knowing every rut and stone. His gaze, habitually drifting towards cabin number 7 to rouse Ilara's family, found only an empty space. His initial reaction was not fear, but profound confusion. His aged eyes, accustomed to the dimness, struggled to reconcile what they saw with what they knew to be true. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The mist swirled gently over a patch of bare earth, revealing the perfectly outlined rectangle of the stone foundation. The stones, usually partially obscured by the cabin's walls, now lay exposed, clean and stark against the damp soil. No splintered wood, no scattered nails, no charred remains, no disturbed earth around the perimeter. Nothing. Just an impossible void where a solid structure had stood for decades. The bucket clattered from his hand, the water splashing around his feet, a cold shock that did little to clear the fog from his mind. His scream, when it finally tore from his throat, was a sound of pure, unadulterated bewilderment, a primal cry against the impossible. The sound ripped through the quiet quarters, pulling others from their sleep. First came the murmurs, then the confused questions, then the gasps of disbelief as they too witnessed the impossible void. A small crowd gathered, their breath pluming in the chill, their faces etched with a mixture of terror and profound bewilderment. They circled the empty space, their eyes scanning the surrounding trees, the distant fields, as if the cabin might have simply been misplaced, perhaps rolled away by some unseen force. But the ground was undisturbed, the dew still fresh on the grass beyond the foundation. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed the structure whole, then meticulously smoothed over its tracks. Silas Croft, the overseer, burst from his small, unkempt house, his nightshirt flapping, a shotgun clutched in one hand. His face, usually a mask of sour authority, was contorted with a mixture of sleep-addled confusion and burgeoning rage. "What in tarnation is all this racket?" he bellowed, his voice hoarse. Then he saw it. His eyes, still bleary, focused on the gathering of dark figures, all pointing towards the same impossible absence. He pushed through the crowd, his boots crunching on the gravel path, his breath catching in his throat as he reached the edge of the empty space. He stared, his jaw slack, the shotgun lowering slowly in his hand until its barrel rested on the ground. His mind, accustomed to the brutal logic of the plantation, struggled to process the scene. A cabin. A solid cypress wood cabin, built on a sturdy stone foundation, secured with iron nails. Gone, without a trace. He knelt, his knees cracking, and ran a trembling hand over the smooth, cool surface of a foundation stone. It was clean. Too clean. He sniffed the air, expecting the acrid scent of smoke, the damp smell of rot, the metallic tang of blood. But there was nothing but the faint, sweet smell of dew-kissed earth and the distant aroma of wood smoke from the other cabins. The sun, now a fiery orange orb on the horizon, cast long, distorted shadows across the impossible void, making the absence even more profound, more sinister. Croft's initial disbelief quickly morphed into a furious panic. "Where are they? Where are they all?" He roared, his voice cracking. He spun around, his eyes darting from face to face in the bewildered crowd. "Tobias, Ilara, Lena, where are they?" But the faces staring back at him were as confused as his own. No one had seen them leave. No one had heard anything. He immediately dispatched a few field hands to search the immediate vicinity, the woods, the creek, the cane fields. He ordered others to fetch the bloodhounds from the main house. The dogs, 2 lean, powerful animals, were brought to the site, their leashes straining. They sniffed the clean foundation, then the surrounding earth, their wet noses twitching. They circled the empty rectangle once, twice, then stopped, confused. They whined, looked up at their handler, then back at the ground, seemingly unable to pick up any scent, any trail. It was as if the people and the cabin had simply ceased to exist, leaving no olfactory footprint behind. The crowd of witnesses grew, drawn by the shouts and the sheer, unbelievable spectacle. Whispers began to circulate, hushed and fearful. Some spoke of spirits, of conjuring, of the devil's work. Others, more pragmatic, suggested a fire that had burned so hot it left no trace, or a flood that had somehow lifted the entire structure. But each theory was immediately dismissed by the stark reality of the scene. No ash, no scorch marks, no water damage, no disturbed earth. The impossible had not just happened. It had happened with an eerie, meticulous precision that defied all understanding. The silence that followed Croft's initial outburst was heavy, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. It was the silence of a world suddenly unhinged, where the very ground beneath their feet seemed to have betrayed its solidity. The news reached Sheriff Thomas Brody by mid-morning, carried by a breathless, terrified rider from Belle Reve. Brody, a man in his late 50s with a neatly trimmed beard and a reputation for methodical, if slow, deduction, initially dismissed it as a drunken exaggeration. "A cabin vanished? Without a trace? Nonsense, boy. Probably burned down and the fool overseer can't find the ashes." But the rider's insistence, his wide, frightened eyes, convinced Brody to saddle his horse. He arrived at Belle Reve with 2 deputies, their faces grim, their skepticism quickly dissolving into profound bewilderment as they stood before the impossible void. Sheriff Brody was a man of facts, of tangible evidence. He knelt, just as Croft had, and ran his gloved hand over the clean foundation stones. He examined the surrounding earth, looking for footprints, drag marks, anything. He found nothing. The dew was still undisturbed beyond the precise rectangle of the foundation. He sniffed the air, his keen nose detecting only the damp earth and the faint, sweet smell of the nearby magnolias. No smoke, no decay, no metallic tang. "Mr. Croft," Brody said, his voice calm, despite the growing unease in his gut. "Tell me exactly what you found." Croft, still agitated, recounted the morning's discovery, his voice rising in pitch as he described the emptiness. "They just vanished, Sheriff, the whole lot of them. Tobias, Ilara, Lena, the boy Caleb, Ruth, Daniel, all gone." Brody then began his meticulous 1865-style forensic examination. He instructed his deputies to measure the foundation, to sketch its precise dimensions, to note every detail of the surrounding area. He walked the perimeter of the quarters, then the edge of the woods, his eyes scanning for any anomaly. He found none. The woods were dense, but showed no signs of a large structure being dragged through them. The creek was calm, its banks undisturbed. Next came the interviews. Brody spoke to every slave on the plantation, individually, away from Croft's intimidating presence. He asked about the family in cabin number 7, about any strange occurrences, any rumors, any plans of escape. The answers were frustratingly consistent. The family was quiet, hard-working, well-respected. No one had seen them leave. No one had heard anything unusual in the night. Their faces, however, held a mixture of fear and a strange, almost defiant silence. Brody, a man who understood the unspoken language of the enslaved, sensed a deeper truth, a shared secret. But he couldn't break through the wall of their collective silence. They spoke of the wind, of owls, of dreams. He interviewed Silas Croft again, pressing him on his patrols, his observations. Croft, growing increasingly defensive, insisted he had seen nothing, heard nothing. "I tell you, Sheriff, they just disappeared. It's unnatural. Witchcraft, I tell you." Brody dismissed the supernatural claims with a wave of his hand. "There's no witchcraft, Mr. Croft, only facts, and the facts here are perplexing." Brody then turned his attention to the physical impossibility. He knew the approximate dimensions of the cabin. He estimated its weight. Hundreds of pounds of cypress logs, shingles, nails, and the few meager furnishings. How? He mused aloud to his deputies. Does one move a structure of that size and weight without wagons, without a team of oxen, without leaving so much as a splinter or a disturbed patch of earth? They calculated. To dismantle such a cabin, even with proper tools, would take days, if not weeks, and would generate an immense amount of noise. To move the materials would require multiple trips, heavy wagons, and a clear path. None of this evidence existed. Brody systematically eliminated every logical theory. Fire. No ash, no scorch marks, no smell of smoke, he stated, pointing to the clean foundation. A fire hot enough to vaporize a cabin would leave a crater, not a clean slate. Flood. The ground is dry. The creek is low, he observed. No water lines on the trees, no debris washed up. A flood capable of lifting a cabin would have devastated the entire quarters. Demolition. Where are the tools? Where is the rubble? Where is the sound? He asked, gesturing to the empty space. Even a planned demolition leaves a mess, and this is pristine. Theft. Who steals an entire cabin? Brody scoffed. And how do they do it without a trace? No wagon tracks, no drag marks, no broken branches. It's not a pocket watch, it's a house. Tracking attempts were equally futile. Brody ordered his deputies to fan out, searching in all directions for miles around Belle Reve. They found nothing. No footprints leading away from the plantation, no signs of passage through the dense undergrowth, no discarded items. The bloodhounds, brought back for a second attempt, again circled the empty foundation, whined, and sat down, defeated. The frustration mounted. Brody, a man who prided himself on solving every case, found himself staring at an enigma that defied all logic, all experience. He called in regional authorities, men from Baton Rouge and New Orleans, hoping for a fresh perspective. They arrived, equally perplexed, their sophisticated, for the time, methods yielding no more answers than Brody's simpler approach. The story, too strange to keep quiet, began to leak to the newspapers. Local papers ran sensational headlines. Plantation cabin vanishes, mystery in the bayou. The case became a local legend, a source of endless speculation and fear. Brody, for the first time in his career, felt utterly defeated, his methodical mind unable to grasp the impossible truth. The story of the vanished cabins spread like wildfire through Louisiana, carried by hushed whispers, exaggerated rumors, and increasingly sensational newspaper reports. It was a tale that tapped into the deepest fears and anxieties of a society teetering on the brink of radical change. For the white plantation owners, it was a chilling omen, a symbol of their crumbling control. If a whole cabin, with its occupants, could simply disappear, what else was possible? Panic began to ripple through the planter class. Meetings were held in dimly lit parlors, brandy flowing freely, as men discussed the unnatural occurrence at Belle Reve. Security was immediately tightened on plantations across the region. Overseers doubled their patrols, bloodhounds were kept on constant alert, and any slave found outside their quarters after dark faced severe punishment. The fear of copycat disappearances became a pervasive dread. Some owners, convinced it was the work of abolitionist agents or even Union soldiers, sent desperate pleas to what remained of Confederate authorities, demanding protection against this unseen, impossible threat. Indeed, in the weeks and months that followed, there were reports of other escape attempts, some successful, some brutally suppressed. But none matched the sheer audacity and inexplicable nature of Cabin Number 7. A few individuals managed to slip away, often with the help of the nascent networks forming in the wake of the war, but never an entire family, and never leaving behind such a pristine, empty space. The Belle Reve incident remained unique. A ghost story whispered around campfires, a riddle that haunted the minds of those in power. Silas Croft, the overseer, was perhaps the most profoundly affected. The disappearance of Cabin Number 7 became his personal obsession, a festering wound on his psyche. His already volatile temper worsened, fueled by drink and a gnawing sense of failure. He would spend hours staring at the empty foundation, pacing its perimeter, muttering to himself. He saw shadows where there were none, heard whispers in the wind. He became convinced that the family was still nearby, hiding, mocking him. He organized relentless searches of the woods and swamps, dragging exhausted field hands through treacherous terrain, but found nothing. His once authoritative voice became a hoarse croak, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. He neglected his duties, his mind consumed by the impossible riddle. Mr. Beaumont, the plantation owner, eventually dismissed him, unable to tolerate his overseer's mental deterioration and the constant unsettling reminder of the incident. Croft left Belle Reve a broken man, his once firm belief in his own control shattered by an empty space. For the enslaved, the story of Cabin Number 7 had a different, more complex resonance. On the surface, it was a terrifying mystery, a reminder of the unpredictable nature of their lives. But beneath the fear, a flicker of something else began to glow. Hope. If a cabin could vanish, if a family could simply disappear without a trace, then perhaps the impossible was indeed possible. Perhaps freedom, too, could arrive in unexpected, miraculous ways. The story became a legend, whispered in hushed tones, a symbol of resistance, a testament to ingenuity and a source of quiet inspiration. It fueled dreams of escape, of a life beyond the reach of the overseer's whip and the master's chains. It gave them a sense of agency, a belief that even in the darkest of times there were ways to defy the oppressor, to carve out a path to an unimaginable future. The authorities, despite their continued efforts, found no answers. Sheriff Brody, though he never admitted defeat, quietly closed the case after several months, filing it away as unsolved, inexplicable. The regional authorities, equally baffled, eventually moved on to other, more tangible crimes. The newspaper coverage dwindled, replaced by new headlines about Reconstruction, about the struggles of a nation trying to heal its wounds. But the empty foundation at Belle Reve remained, a silent monument to an impossible event, a constant unsettling reminder that some mysteries simply refused to be solved. Some truths remained stubbornly out of reach. The case went cold, but the legend, far from fading, only grew stronger with each passing year. Years passed, turning into a decade, then two. The Civil War faded into memory, replaced by the turbulent era of Reconstruction and its eventual painful unraveling. The Belle Reve Plantation, like many others, struggled to adapt. Mr. Beaumont, unable to maintain his workforce, eventually sold off parcels of land, and the grand house fell further into disrepair. But the empty foundation of Cabin Number 7 remained, a permanent scar on the landscape, a silent, enduring question mark. By the 1870s, the story of the vanished cabin had become a legend passed down through generations. It was told around hearths in freedmen's communities, whispered by old-timers to wide-eyed children, and occasionally recounted in hushed tones by white locals, always with a shiver of unease. The details became embellished, the impossible feat growing grander with each retelling. Some claimed it was a divine intervention, a miracle from God. Others spoke of a powerful conjure woman who had spirited the cabin away. But the core of the story remained, a solid structure, and its occupants had simply ceased to be. Sheriff Thomas Brody, now retired, would occasionally be asked about the case. He would sigh, shake his head, and recount the facts, always ending with the same bewildered conclusion. Never seen anything like it. No evidence. No explanation. Just gone. The case remained officially unsolved, a blot on his otherwise distinguished record. Silas Croft, the former overseer, never recovered from the incident. He drifted from one failed venture to another, his mind increasingly consumed by the phantom cabin. He would often be seen in taverns, a bottle clutched in his hand, muttering about them darkies and their devilry, his eyes darting nervously, as if expecting the cabin to reappear before him. He died a few years after the war, a broken, haunted man, his last words reportedly a confused plea to find the cabin. Yet, amidst the legends and the official silence, subtle hints began to emerge. Fragments of a possible truth, whispered among the growing population of freed people who had migrated north or settled in burgeoning cities like New Orleans, Chicago, and New York. In Chicago, a skilled carpenter, known for his meticulous work and his quiet, watchful demeanor, was making a name for himself. He specialized in dismantling old structures and repurposing their wood, a rare skill. His hands, though calloused, moved with a familiar precision. His name was Tobias. He rarely spoke of his past, but his eyes held a deep, unyielding wisdom, and he often looked at the stars with a faraway gaze. In New Orleans, a respected elder, a woman known for her healing remedies and her profound knowledge of herbs, ran a small, thriving apothecary. Her hair was now fully white, but her eyes, sharp and knowing, missed nothing. Her name was Ilara. She was a pillar of her community, a source of strength and guidance. She often told stories of resilience and ingenuity, of how the oppressed could find ways to overcome the impossible, but she never spoke directly of a vanished cabin. A young woman, intelligent and articulate, became a teacher in a freedmen's school in St. Louis. She taught children to read and write, her passion for knowledge infectious. Her name was Lena. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, and her lessons often included tales of courage and the power of collective action. And a young man, now grown, a quiet but observant soul, worked as a guide for those seeking new lives in the north, helping them navigate the complex routes and hidden pathways. His name was Caleb. He had an uncanny ability to read the land, to find paths where none seemed to exist, and his memory for details was extraordinary. He often spoke of the importance of leaving no trace, of moving like shadows in the night. These were just whispers, of course, coincidences perhaps. No one ever definitively connected these individuals to the vanished cabin of Belle Reve. The Underground Railroad, though officially disbanded, had left behind a legacy of incredible feats of escape, of networks that could make people disappear as if into thin air. Its methods, its secrecy, its sheer audacity were legendary. It was a network built on trust, on silence, and on the meticulous planning of the impossible. The enduring mystery of Cabin Number 7 remained unsolved, a testament to the power of human will against insurmountable odds. It was a story that defied logic, a historical anomaly that continued to puzzle and intrigue. Was it a miracle? A meticulously planned escape, executed with such precision that it left no trace, or something else entirely? The empty foundation at Belle Reve, now overgrown with weeds and moss, offered no answers. It simply stood, a silent, haunting reminder of the day an entire slave cabin vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a legend that would echo through time, forever challenging the boundaries of belief.